Good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, June 15th, and I am Mark Canavera, the Associate Director of the Care and Protection of Children, or CPC Learning Network, and I'm very excited about today's webinar. This is a piece of learning and research and guidance that I have been involved with from the very beginning. So it has been a labor of love for the past 5 years. Sometimes you finish a long learning process and look back and think, oh gosh, we didn't learn that much. But I think as you're going to hear from Pia today, we learned quite a lot, and also have a lot more questions about how to improve our work as child protection practitioners working around the world that emerged from this work. The topic at hand is child protection system strengthening, and that is a phrase that has come to mean a lot of different things over the past decade, and certainly has been a site of much discussion, much contestation over the past several years. I think you're going to be very impressed with the clarity and the clarity of thinking and preciseness that our speaker brings to this. You're going to have two speakers today. The first one is Pia Vraalsen, whose screen you are currently seeing, and the second one will be yours truly, me, Mark. Pia is going to present Adapting to Learn, Learning to Adapt, which was a key considerations document that Child Frontiers, the organization that Pia is an associate of, developed on behalf of the Disaster Risk Reduction and System Strengthening Task Force of what was the Child Protection Working Group, and then this document, which you can find in the handout section of your screen, became the first product of the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. A few housekeeping notes before I introduce Pia. One is that you can send us questions or chats through the little chat box, which you should see on your panel there. We'll be monitoring those throughout the webinar, and we'll have a Q&A towards the end. We're expecting that Pia will present for about 20 minutes, and then I will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes at the end to go through Q&A. Sometimes we go over by 10 to 15 minutes if there's a lot of discussion and a lot of questions, but we do try to keep it as close to an hour as possible. Secondly, there will be a recording of this webinar, so you can access it or share it with your colleagues once you realize how truly brilliant all of this learning is and want to share it with the world, which we hope you will. And finally, feel free to just send us a note to let us know if you're not hearing or if you're having technical difficulties, and we'll figure that out. With no further ado then, Pia Vraalsen is not only a friend of mine, but a senior associate with Child Frontiers. And by way of caveats, I should add that I used to be an associate with Child Frontiers before joining the CPC Learning Network here at Columbia University. Pia has over 12 years of experience as a child protection specialist in complex emergencies, natural disasters in developing countries all over the world, the Middle East, Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. Pia started her career managing UNICEF child protection programs in emergencies in South Sudan, Sierra Leone, Pakistan, and Indonesia, but more recently has been focused on research and evaluation, especially related to this topic of child protection systems in both humanitarian and development settings. So Pia, with no further ado, over to you for our core presentation.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody for joining. Just to check, is everybody seeing my screen clearly? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes.
I am, so let's hope others are, but please send us a note if you are not.
I seem to be having a little bit of an issue, sorry, here, because I'm sharing my presentation, but it's not allowing me to click through it for some reason. Ah, here we go. Okay, it's all sorted. Right, so just to give you a short overview of what I'm going to be sharing with you during this presentation, I'm just going to give you a very sort of brief background as to what some of the agency discussion around child protection systems has been and how that's defined and looked at and means to different agencies. Then I'm going to take you through part of the process in developing these key considerations. We're looking at what the lessons learned are to date in terms of child protection systems in emergencies. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about what the key considerations that we subsequently developed generally look at. So there's been lots of agency debate amongst international agencies in terms of what we mean by child protection systems. And one of the first things that we did in this work was to try and look at what those different agency definitions were and what the similarities or differences from emerged were. One is the general acknowledgement that child protection systems include both the formal systems, so those that have been sanctioned by laws, regulations, policies, etc., but that child protection systems also include the non-formal systems for child protection that largely exist as a result of attitudes, values, behavior, social norms and traditional practices in society. There is a general acknowledgement that the interconnections between the different system components and different levels of the system are present or should be present and are important. And again, this goes back to the kind of overarching goal of a system. And the general acknowledgement there as well is that in an ideal world, there would be an overall intended goal of a child protection system, but that more often than not, there are a series of goals, not necessarily ones that align themselves to an overall intended goal of a system. Time. So child protection systems are static. Seems like an obvious point, but quite often they are treated as being quite static. And I think especially in emergencies, the non-static nature of child protection systems becomes all the more important, whereby the variables that influence a system in terms of its goals, in terms of its need, in terms of its function, are likely to change quite quickly. And influence the context in which the child protection system sits. Generally speaking, most agencies identify a series of components that underpin a child protection system. These include the legal and policy framework, the structures in the systems, the services available in a system, coordination functions, information management, and the resources within the system. And when we really started doing this work, what became very clear to us was that this was really a kind of idealized theoretical framework of the components of a system and what a system should look like. But it really wasn't taking into account the reality of how systems manifest themselves and differ in different contexts. So in some ways it was actually quite limiting. There are different actors at different ecological levels, which are all important in terms of contributing to and being part of a child protection system. And those include the child, the family, the community, society at large, and of course the state. One very, very big point is that a child protection system is entirely unique. There will never be, or should never be, two child protection systems that are exactly the same or are assumed to be exactly the same. And as such, the socio-cultural norms, the political landscape, the economy, the historical setting, and the legal and normative frameworks are extremely important in defining what a child protection system looks like, how it operates at the different levels, and what those interactions are. So just to give you a very brief overview of how we got to developing these key considerations for strengthening child protection systems in emergencies. So there was a general acknowledgement amongst the group that this area remained a gap, and that perhaps within the sort of development sector there had been a much longer standing debate around child protection systems. But that this debate hadn't really taken place in the sort of humanitarian arena. So the Interagency Task Force on Child Protection System Strengthening and DRR of, as Mark said, what was then the Global Child Protection Working Group and is now the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, decided to develop guidance or considerations on system strengthening in emergencies. Now, very quickly, as the discussion progressed, it became clear amongst the group, for reasons that I will go into more detail later in this presentation, that we wouldn't look at developing guidance per se, but that really what we wanted to do was look at what are some of the considerations for system strengthening in emergencies. And really the fundamental point was taking a systems view to child protection entails taking a step back and thinking through the unique and complex contexts in which we are working. And that the kind of overly prescriptive pitfalls of guidance needed to be avoided. And I'll speak to that in a little bit more detail later. The process in developing these key considerations was a desk review, which included a whole series of in-depth studies on child protection systems in emergencies, agency evaluations, other types of reports, and a whole series of key informant interviews, both at the global level, regional level, and country level. The key considerations were completed in June 2016, but I just really want to highlight there that we very much perceive this as a first step in starting to articulate some of this thinking. So what are some of the key lessons learned that we managed to extract during this process? As Mark said in his introduction, we really felt that we were able to extract some real emerging themes. The findings from the desk review and the interviews that were conducted were remarkably consistent across the board, and that really included different geographical regions, different types of emergencies, so, you know, conflict, natural disaster, protracted, etc. The findings were exceptionally consistent regardless. One of the key themes that came out was the tendency to establish parallel systems. And this was really viewed as very problematic for a whole host of reasons. One being the potential to undermine existing systems, so efforts that were already underway. And I know I've mentioned this to some of you before, but I read a very interesting article a few years ago that really spoke to me, and it really spoke to this piece of work as well. And it was called the Week 3 Effect. And it was referring to the Haiyan experience in the Philippines, but also taking a more global view to how humanitarian response took place. And the notion there was that in week 3 is when the international community had really descended on an emergency, and how this really undermined and was disempowering for local efforts that were already underway. Almost this kind of assumption that the shock of an emergency meant that nothing was happening. And actually there were many efforts underway, and they were quite undermined by that sort of descending of this international community and this establishing parallel systems that didn't necessarily speak to the systems that were already there or response that was taking place. And of course this is unsustainable as well. And in several of the studies that had taken place, it was quite interesting because there were very similar ways of describing it, which was the humanitarian machine sort of parachuting in, and then almost as quickly as they had parachuted in, they would leave, and it would leave this vacuum, which was not then sustainable in meeting subsequent needs because it had not been aligned to existing systems. And of course, this is also highly problematic in terms of ensuring that the response that is taking place is appropriate and relevant to the context, both in terms of meeting the emerging needs, but the way in which meeting those needs is done within the context that it sits. There is a notion that we're increasingly blueprint and checklist driven in the child protection and emergency sector, that we are overly pre-prescribed and overly standardized. In some interviews and in some of the reports that we read, there was even a description of people knowing what they were going to do in terms of the response before they had even arrived in country. And as you can imagine, that is highly problematic. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about this, but one of the pitfalls that respondents were describing was that there's a notion that the checklists or blueprints are ultimately contextualized. What we're finding, though, is that this isn't necessarily the case, or more often than not, it is not the case. And what does this mean when you want to strengthen in-country child protection systems? Systems are not perceived as holistic, so there's a tendency to work on individual components of a system, but with very little view to how those link and relate to each other. Also acknowledging that there's many different levels of a system, from the family to the subnational to the regional to the international, etc., and how those speak to each other. I don't think this is a new notion to most people, but there is very much a sense that when we talk about systems that we're actually just repackaging a previous approach. So what has really changed? You know, we moved away from a kind of thematic approach to child protection to system strengthening. But actually, in reality, in terms of what we're doing, very little has actually changed. And is this really a question of conceptual ambiguity, or is it also more a question of, well, what does that mean in a practical sense in terms of what we're doing? And heavy focus on response services over prevention in general. I think one of the...
just to jump in here on that last point you made, Pia, one of the most striking quotes that we found in the research was from an operational representative of one of the major organizations who works in child protection, and that person said, "We're doing the same thing that we've always done. We're now just calling it system strengthening." All right, yeah. Back to you.
No, thank you. And it absolutely came up several times. And I just want to also say that, I mean, this is something that I think in the development sector, they've really grappled with as well, because we seem to have just repackaged something, but not much has actually changed in terms of what we're doing. So, yeah. Context matters, and I can't underscore this enough because it's come up so strongly in the work that we were doing, and it's something that I think we make a lot of assumptions around is taking place, but actually what we found is that it's really lacking, and it's lacking from the point of view that, well, in fact, we discussed this at length during this process because we were saying, well, why isn't it happening? And I don't think we actually even have the answer to that, whether it's a sense that there isn't time to do that adequately, whether there's a sense that it's not important enough, whether it's a sense that we don't actually know what contextualizing means in practical terms, how that can inform the kind of global tools that we seem to be using everywhere. But it's a very problematic area, and it's something that we need to think about. As we were doing this work, there was kind of, one thing was the sort of lessons learned side in terms of what we know has happened and from various emergencies. But another sort of emerging area that came up very strongly was, are we actually organizationally geared towards strengthening child protection systems in emergencies? And what is that then, what does that actually mean for us if we're not? And the reasons this issue came up so strongly was that we found that the nature of agencies' mandates and structures were organized to look at certain parts, but not create a full and holistic understanding of a system in the context that they were working. So it was almost sort of stopping that from happening. One thing that we all know, for those of us who have worked in emergencies, is that the funding cycles are really problematic. They tend to be project-based, and they don't facilitate a kind of medium or longer term view. They're very kind of chopped up into different stages of the emergency or short-term projects. And of course also the phased approach to emergencies. So many organizations described a problematic view to system strengthening
I think we've lost Pia momentarily.
Oh, can you hear me now?
There you are, there you are.
Sorry, which bit did you lose me on?
I don't remember the last few words. I would just do the last 15 seconds or so.
Okay, so the funding issue in terms of funding cycles and emergencies being primarily project-based and leading to sort of piecemeal pieces of work, but not taking a longer-term view to system strengthening in a humanitarian response. But this equally also applies to the phased approach to emergencies in terms of work plans, staffing, etc. So staff were often described as being, different trenches of staff for different stages of an emergency, which is understandable, but was then posing very significant problems in terms of taking a view to system strengthening in emergencies. The development humanitarian divide, which I think we all know too well. This is really also was found to be very problematic from the point of view that it was causing difficulties in terms of planning. So we would be much better able to plan and contextualize and take a system strengthening view if we were incorporating our development colleagues much more at the sort of initial stages of a humanitarian response, but also equally so in terms of transition. So how is the humanitarian response sufficiently being transitioned into the work that our development colleagues are undertaking, rather than this, as somebody described at one point, this kind of cliff So the humanitarian operation finishes and everything just falls off this cliff and it doesn't transition. Lack of learning. This was a really huge point that came out. And I think we were able to see it because we were able to speak to people in much more depth. But we know that there's a lot of learning. We know that there's a lot of evaluations that have taken place. We know that there's so many studies and other research pieces that have come out of the work that we've done. However, the honesty about mistakes made and the learning that we have through that work is not being discussed or allowed to surface. And as a result, the same mistakes are being repeated time and time again. And one of the reasons that one of the respondents attributed this to was just that kind of sense of safeguarding, any sense of failure within your agency and not wanting to make it public. The desire to have set plans and logical frameworks from the outset of a program. So many people that we spoke to said, well, it's an emergency. You have to respond immediately. The needs are pressing. Now that may well be so, but what we're finding due to the nature of the way that agencies plan and develop their programs was that there was actually very little room to then go back and inform those programs and change them once they were determined. So that immediate response without actually having thought through or gotten to know the context sufficiently and the needs and what is relevant and appropriate, you were no longer able to apply that at a later stage. So you can imagine that's not great. Just some of the key messages that came out of this key considerations, and Mark, as he said, has included that as a handout. So it's relatively long. I'm not going to go through all that in a huge amount of detail. But some of the key messages were adapting to learn. So adapting our ways of working so we are better able to learn. Rather than others having to adapt to the way that we work in a way, which seems a pretty obvious notion, but it doesn't seem to be working that way. And learning to adapt, so learning and understanding how to better contextualize interventions. It really does appear to remain a gap at the moment. Recognize that there are always existing child protection systems and a range of actors. We heard so many times when we did this piece of work, people said, but there wasn't a child protection system, maybe because there wasn't believed to be one in country or because that system was believed to be under such tremendous strain because of the emergency. However, there is always a child protection system. And it goes back to the non-static nature of child protection systems. So what was your system pre-emergency might not be exactly the same in the emergency, but for sure there will be child protection system and child protection actors at the local and national level who will still be responding. So we went through this process of developing guiding questions. And some of the areas, kind of sub-areas that we were looking at was, for example, so the outcomes. What are the outcomes for children and families? And it was really something that struck us when we were doing this piece of work, that we seem to have lost sight of that a little bit, particularly with our kind of overly pre-prescribed and standardized approaches to addressing child protection in emergencies. The genuine outcomes for children and families as opposed to the establishment of programs that just sort of serve themselves seems to be a little bit lost. Systems, what exists at the different levels and what is that interaction between those different levels. Socio-cultural norms that the system is fundamentally based on. And there seems to be sometimes an unwillingness to look at that and work on that, in particular if those are deemed to be sort of unfavorable from an international agency's point of view. However, they're still there and they're still informing the system in that given context and need to be understood. What are the perspectives of those within the system? And what are their perceptions of us or you? So what do they think is the most relevant and appropriate? And the work that you are doing. And again, that won't remain static over time and needs to be visited frequently. What is your role within the system? Ultimately, you become part of that system as well. You are an actor within that system, and what is your role? And what is your role with the different levels of interaction? What are our assumptions and preconceptions coming into a new context? And again, seems like such an obvious point that that would be something you would think of, but it's clearly not quite happening, especially in the way that we seem to replicate what was done.
So there went Pia again. But I know she's coming to the end of her presentation. I'm guessing we're going to get her back with a splash momentarily. There she is again.
Oh no! Did you lose me?
Yes, yes. But why don't you take another minute or two and wrap up the presentation, Pia?
I'm actually, well, I had just finished.
That was it. All right. One last sentence, maybe? Repeat the last sentence, and I think we'll be good to go.
Okay, so the continuum of action was what I was talking about. So how can we complement and support actors at all levels within the existing system? Also in terms of transitioning to ensure sustainability in the work that takes place in humanitarian action.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this, Pia. And I know the work very closely and personally and have seen this presentation before, but am always, it stirs new thoughts. And what it stirred for me this time was the idea that we really need to learn how to contextualize. And what does that mean in a very practical way, I think is an important consideration. I am now going to become the presenter. As I switch to my screen, you're looking at my emails there, I did just want to remind you that you can send questions and comments through the chat box. I'm going to try to present quite briefly and then have an ample amount of time for discussion and comments. Pia mentioned that this task force, and I see that some of our attendees have been involved in the work of the task force over the years. One of those people being Anita Queiratza. I apologize, Anita, if I pronounced your last name wrong, who co-led the task force with me on behalf of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. And we also have one of the researchers, Dion Akiyama, who undertook the field research in Haiti back in 2012, taking a look back at that point in time, which was about 2 years after the earthquake, what people thought about their system strengthening interventions. And it was an interesting time because there had been discrete projects that were called system strengthening projects, and there had been a lot of concerted thinking first at the level of how do we support the government, and at the time Dion did the research there, how do we now work with the government to strengthen Haitian civil society on child protection. So it was a very fruitful time for learning. I'm just going to take you through just a few thoughts. Pia mentioned that there isn't really agreement on how to think about child protection systems. I think the document itself, which is available in handouts, takes us lays these out quite well and presents the literature. And I don't want to spend a long time on that, but I do want to make a few points about it. And then thoughts on moving towards more contextualized, more relevant family and community-centered systems. So just a few slides and a few thoughts on approaches to even thinking about child protection systems, which presenting in this in 2012, I realized that we haven't had a robust discussion on systems. that's sector-wide in quite a while, which is sad to me because I don't think you can ultimately get away from a systems approach. This was the 2010 seminal document on child protection systems developed by Chapin Hall, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, at the University of Chicago. And the document itself is still quite a strong read, and I do recommend locating it and reading it if you can, if you have the time for that. But one thing that I notice when I look at this graph, which is one of the core graphics from the document, is that over here you can kind of see on the right, I'm not sure if you're seeing my mouse, you can kind of see the checklist of components of a child protection system emerging. Governance, management, enforcement, human resources, infrastructure, funding. So when we heard Pia say that people tended to focus on specific components of the system, I think even those who were doing the conceptual work in the international community were doing the same. And another starting point for thinking about systems would really be to think about the orientations. I'm putting this book up here, Towards Positive Systems of Child and Family Welfare, International Comparisons of Child Protection, Family Service, and Community Caring Systems, which Nancy Freymond and Gary Cameron at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada edited over a decade now, but I do still think that this is one of the most cutting-edge documents on thinking about how systems are oriented. What the authors in this edited volume point out is that the starting point and the worldview for child protection systems is quite different depending on where you sit in the world, and that the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia would be exemplars of what they call a child protection, or others call a rescue and response, or yet others call a managerial model, in which the state intervenes only when a family is perceived to have failed. And there are very specific sociocultural and historical reasons for that, but it is quite different from what these authors call a family service orientation, which you find in much of continental Europe and in Scandinavian countries. I'm just adding here that there are quite a few books that do comparative analysis of child protection systems across European countries. So this typology, I think even the authors would recognize as quite a simplification and an oversimplification, but it is worth thinking about the fact that in some countries, social workers have contact with families long before there are problems and are just part of the service delivery structure. Both of those models require relatively robust revenue, tax systems, governance models in which governments have a resource base from which to deliver services. But these authors make the point then that in much of the post-colonial world, community caring systems in collectivist cultures, and the ones they use in the book are First Nations, Aboriginal, and Maori, but I think humanitarian aid workers are working in zones frequently that do have collectivist worldviews and community caring systems in which communities are responsible for raising children. The nuclear family is much more extended. And so both humanitarian operations and governments are often looking at a melange or a blend or a hybrid of different kinds of worldviews and orientations that are underpinning and driving their work. So that's just a reminder there. And then the typology that the book lays out, the handout that we have here, Adapting to Learn, is working from the Bronfenbrenner socio-ecological model and really thinking about the relationship levels, noting that there are just many levels of actors and that these different levels have different actors, different impetuses, etc. I put a little quote up at the top here to remember that all system diagrams are simplifications of the real world, and again, oversimplifications. But I do just want to put this up as the model that the Adapting to Learn authors did ultimately use. I imagine most of you are quite familiar with this. Moving towards contextualized, relevant family and community-centered systems, I just want to share some of the learning from the research process that we undertook over a number of years. I'm going to focus on a few key points. Returning to that idea that systems orientations are reflective of worldviews, I just want to note that the very conceptualization of the system is going to guide how policymakers, service providers, humanitarian actors, and others believe that they should act. The same would be true for parents, families, caregivers. Their relationship with different levels of the system is going to have an impact on whether or not they turn to external actors for services, whether or not they take care of things themselves. And we need to remember that worldview and sociocultural considerations are very important in this discussion. If you start by thinking about systems like this, ... I am putting up 3 examples here. We've recently saw the Chapin Hall UNICEF model. In the middle of this slide is one page of the Child Protection Systems Mapping Toolkit that was developed after the Chapin Hall paper that we just saw, and you can see that this includes, a list line by line of specific age considerations. What are the legal ages for child justice, for marriage, for consent to sexual relations, for legal employment? Looking down, does the Constitution include provisions on child rights? What's the mechanism used to give effect to international instruments? Is there a comprehensive legal framework on child protection? Is there a national child protection policy statement or framework document? If you start by thinking of these components and these lists, on the right I'm showing some work that I myself did that I hope to be critical about as well, where we were actually counting the number of social welfare and family strengthening structures in each region of Cameroon, comparing those to the poverty rates in those regions. If you start looking at things from a bean counting or a checklist approach, it is going to influence your policy and program responses. And I think that the core point I would like to make about the policy program responses in humanitarian and development settings is that a compliance with international legal frameworks, especially the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is an overarching framework here. That approach has its promoters, it has its detractors. Many people would say that our research is culturally relativist because we are suggesting that children's rights are not universal, but that's not the point we're trying to make. The point we would try to make is that the operationalization of children's rights has been done in a way that leaves communities feeling disempowered. We often heard things like children's rights have ruined our ability to parent, to care for our children. They've made children bad community members. So I think we need to do a lot of thinking around child protection and child rights. We also found in every country where we undertook the research, and I'll visit those in just a minute, a preponderance of predetermined responses. You get a lot of toolkits and action plans, which one guide rightly pointed out are by their very nature neoliberal in the way that they approach action. Pre-cooked child-friendly spaces, and by pre-cooked I mean pre-stocked. Child-friendly spaces are often stored in international organizations' regional headquarters for easier deployment to local emergencies. If you look at this column on the right, this is from a website where you can actually order as part of humanitarian supplies. You've got kits and sets, water and sanitation, food, shelter, clothes, and you come down the list and you can order community development. That's actually something that you can order. You can do the same thing for child-friendly spaces. Another frequent predetermined response we saw was training social service workers on international standards such as social work standards, creating child protection or child rights committees, individuated case management, and referral pathways to other services. On this note of case management, and I realize we have quite a people who work in this realm on the call, I would make the point that referral pathways and case management are firmly rooted in North American models of child protection. I don't say that to suggest that they are the wrong thing to do or that they're not helpful. I'm simply pointing out that they are representative of one worldview that does seek to individuate a case of child maltreatment and then to see it through to a step-by-step logical conclusion. The example we have on this slide on the left is from, I believe, the California Child Welfare Services System, and it maps very closely onto what we see on the right, an IRC and UNICEF document that was released a few years ago called Caring for Child Survivors of Sexual Abuse. My primary point here is not to criticize case management in humanitarian settings. It's to point out that it is one tool that is reflective of a worldview, and that in community caring systems where families and communities take a very different approach to responding to maltreatment, the pathway through case management is not likely to be so linear or logical. I do ask the question to us all, if there isn't another way, are the systems that we're promoting reflective of locally shared beliefs, values, and worldviews? I think we have sufficient evidence that they are not, and that there is often misalignment between local systems and those that we have been very meticulously designing and promoting from the international community. But that if we flipped the script and started by looking at the world from the point of view of children and their families, we might be looking for natural helpers, figuring out what the existing processes are. When Pia made the point that there are always child protection systems, I think that as long as there are families, there will be child protection systems. Focusing a bit on three key points that we learned from a series of studies that we undertook in Haiti, Cote d'Ivoire, the Philippines, Palestine, and South Sudan, for which the guiding research question was, how did emergency response actors efforts, and there should be an apostrophe on that, actors, seek to strengthen the national child protection system? I do want to note that we are not claiming that, you know, the impact was what people thought it was. This was a qualitative study, and we were asking people about what they believed had worked or had not. And the ways that we did this were through a global survey of the child protection field coordinators, and then country-level work in, I believe, all 5 of those countries minus Palestine, for which we had distance interviews. In the countries where we had field work, we also did go to emergency affected communities, so communities that had been affected by the post-electoral violence in Cote d'Ivoire, or in the Philippines, we actually were able to collect data twice, once a desk review and the second time through some field work in some key communities. And asking people there what they believed had changed and how they thought things had changed. through the emergency response. We chose emergencies as a particularly interesting place to start the study because this is a time of tremendous transition and where you can really see the international community in action. The dynamic between international actors and national and local ones is visible. It's something people talk about and think about and have theories about. So that's really part of what we were, as humanitarian actors ourselves, trying to examine. I'm going to just go through 3 points. I will try to make them quickly. The most common thing that people across all of those settings said was an effective strengthening of the child protection system was coordination. You had people from various government ministries and from the international community and, when possible, local civil society coming together to discuss how responses were going to happen. You almost always had something like national and regional and sometimes local child protection working groups. Everyone in all of those countries were discussing how the government could and or should be involved. Often the government co-led. So that was really seen as one of the successes of how you strengthen the system through an emergency response. Some questions that emerged were why there was an impetus to start something new. Many countries already had something like a child council, a children's council, or a child welfare coordinating entity. And so this question of relationships between international and national actors came up a lot. And then vertical integration between these bodies was often remarked to be much weaker. So the ways that a national body would link to the regional bodies in emergency affected areas were not always perceived to be particularly strong. This is my attempt at making a visual diagram. I clearly need to work with a designer, but what we frequently saw was the UN having its governmental mandate operating at the national level and then with national actors and through subcontracts and partnerships with international NGOs, reaching local groups through in the emergency affected areas. And international NGOs also often sat on national child protection committees and etc. What we saw far less of was linkages between these levels. One question that I ask as I read these data and think about this question is whether or not the coordination really is so visible, because we're talking about power relationships here. Who gets to make decisions about something is quite important. And there is certainly a lot of talk about government leadership in emergencies and in the longer term, and also a lot of frustration expressed by government officials about not feeling empowered despite the lip service. And both of those conversations are happening pretty far away from emergency affected peoples. You know, whether or not a national government is in the leadership or co-leadership position of a national child protection working group is an important consideration, but it's also not one that ultimately is very focused on what's happening at the community level. It is very clear from all of the data and research, some of which is published, others of which were not able to be publicly shared, that accountability is flowing upwards. We found almost no evidence of systematic ways in which organizations were consulting with communities on an ongoing way, giving them feedback on their work, creating structured dialogue. We heard a lot about reporting to donors and the ways that child protection outcomes are being measured and defined, I think do respond quite strongly to donor prerogatives. So children affected by armed conflict was constantly noted as an area that they were able to get funding and then programming for, and programmers would try to expand that out a little bit to be able to serve more families and communities. But the ways in which the funding flows created upward mobility, or mobility is the wrong word, but upward flows of information was really quite striking. And that, I think, is largely because funding stays at the top. This is such a striking graph to me. From the U.S. Haiti earthquake funding in the first 2 years, and there has been even more sophisticated work done on this by the group Local to Global, which we can send out in the email that will follow up on this webinar. Amazingly, that DoD in this graph is the U.S. Department of Defense, which received nearly $500 million of the earthquake funding. Then you have a consulting group, Chemonics, receiving $125 million, World Food Program getting $118 million. If you go through all of these, they're all international NGOs or U.S. government agencies, such as Health and Human Services, we see towards the bottom there. So a few organizations are receiving massive amounts of money to respond to emergencies. And in this same study, which comes from the Center for Global Development, they were not even able to track through how much money reached Haitian organizations, much less Haitian people. And I think we found that in many places. In the research in South Sudan, we found that a single year of emergency funding for humanitarian actors could have funded the Ministry of Social Welfare for 67 years at its 2012 operating level. That's a really astounding thing to think about. A single year of emergency funding could have funded an entire ministry for 67 years. So we're talking about extreme discrepancies between what the international community is receiving in terms of resources to undertake the work and what governments and local organizations are receiving. That was my final point, and maybe I should end on a more positive note. I am glad that we are thinking about and continuing to discuss how to contextualize. I think the challenges are many, but I think that we can get there. Please do continue to send in your questions. We do have 2 currently. I'm not sure what people are seeing on their screens now. I hope that it is just the introductory slide. But the first 2 questions are from Isai Mihigo, and my apologies for any mispronunciations in advance. My name is Isai Mihigo, CPIE staff for Plan International Rwanda, who says that CPIE staff should adapt their work to the context instead of coming in the emergencies with the responses in mind. Each community has its way of resolving problems. Culturally sensitive based ways of resolving problems that include child protection issues. It's better to learn from them first so that we can provide appropriate services. How can we avoid conflicts between national and international child protection systems? Pia, I'm going to pass that one over to you while encouraging the audience to continue to send in their thoughts, reactions, and questions.
I think from my point of view, this goes back to, kind of one of your points that you just had, Mark, as well, which is at the end of the day, who are we here to serve? We're here to serve the emergency affected populations. And in order to do that, we have to be, for me, there's kind of 3 key words all the time. What are the needs? And what is the most relevant and appropriate way of meeting those needs? And so I think for me, it just goes back to the fundamental point of really understanding the context and the child protection systems that exist in that country, you know, both, like we said, both at the kind of like more formal level, but also the non-formal level. And how are you working with that in order to meet those needs in the most relevant and appropriate way that genuinely has outcomes for children and families. And I think, you know, that Mark said it as well, like there might be a conflict of interest there sometimes in terms of the way that we work and a rights-based approach, etc. And I'm not, by the way, arguing for or against that, but I think that we do need to be a lot more cognizant of what is happening in a country and what ultimately is going to have an impact and outcomes for the emergency affected population. I don't know if that answers your question or if that was terribly roundabout, but do let me know if it doesn't.
I think one of the most interesting points on that is that you've mentioned, Pia, that organizations are not often structurally set up to do system strengthening, and I agree strongly with your assertion. That has been my experience as well, but I think the data show that pretty strongly. Part of that is the way that emergency actors can arrive in a country for a specific organization and not have to link to colleagues or partners who've been there for a longer period of time. And one of the most striking findings of the global survey that I mentioned was that of all of the 80 people that we surveyed who were child protection field coordinators that year, for the simple question, are you aware of a national child protection action plan or framework, it was either 0 or 1 person had. So there wasn't even kind of cursory knowledge of national policies. I do think we are getting to a better place of trying to learn about what's happening in communities. I think there have been a number of methods that have been designed. I know that TPO Uganda designed some for its work when it began working in South Sudan, just to do very quick understanding of local community processes. I think the Interagency Learning Initiative on community-based child protection mechanisms and child protection systems has provided a number of tools that can be used for that. Isai, you were in Rwanda, and we did work with Plan Rwanda on some ethnographic studies around protection mechanisms in refugee camps. And as Pia said, everyone is there. Everyone has something. Families are always there. We have another question from Shodashi Rahamaji from World Vision Nepal. The challenge we faced in the recent EQ 2015 earthquake was the non-functionality of existing child protection systems. One of the major challenges is to get the structures functional, which takes time. What to do in such time? And I think this is one of the most common questions that we get about system strengthening is it compatible with the need for immediate emergency response? And I'm not sure, Shodashi, but I seem to understand from your question that there is a tension also between government systems and then local level systems. So perhaps Pia would like to talk about those issues. And then from Juanes Carlier, how can we convince donors to give us time and resources to understand the existing child protection systems in the country or region before we shape our interventions and decide on which community systems to strengthen or support? Two excellent questions that go together. And Pia, let's see how your microphone's doing.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, everybody. My mic seems to be cutting a little bit in and out. Anyway, I think it's a really important question, Shodashi, and it's certainly something that came up frequently in the work that we did. And this notion around the non-functionality of an existing child protection system, and I think it partly goes into the thinking that we have around child protection systems as well, and whether they stop working or not. And we certainly know in emergencies that there are parts of a system, perhaps significant parts of a system, that are under huge amounts of strain, but what we do often see is that there's a shift in how that system works. So it's not actually that there's a non-functionality of an existing system. That might be because we have a very subjective view of what the system is, for example. But that's where we then need to, I think, explore in much more detail, well, what is happening? Because as we said, it's not static and certainly not in an emergency. And it might actually change quite significantly in terms of, right, who are the key stakeholders and what are they doing? Other local organizations or local actors might take over in ways that they haven't done before, or other communities, you know, that are less affected, etc. So I think it's understanding some of those dynamics and changes in what's happening in child protection, also including the needs, for example, and what the priorities are. So I think absolutely, and I'm not saying, by the way, that there aren't parts of the system that come under tremendous strain that need support, and that there aren't, you know, immediate actions that need to take place. But I think it is a question of that continuous taking stock and understanding what is happening in that particular context and what the different variables are affecting the child protection system, who the actors are, how they're engaging with each other, which will continue to change over time, even as the emergency goes on. So that's sort of my take on that.
Yeah, I think, Juanes, you're onto something here about the need to persuade donors, because if the funding is so important, and I believe it is, if you see that last slide we saw where, you know, $500 million are going to the Department of Defense for, you know, the earthquake response, you know, then that gives the Department of Defense a very powerful voice. And part of that was to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that was building orphanages. At the same time that the child protection actors, both Haitian and international, were trying to stop the influx of children into orphanages. You know, that money had a very real impact on how things played out. So I think we all need to put our thinking caps on how do we undertake donor engagement and education in a constructively critical way. I think, Pia, also, just to respond to what you just said about even the definition of problems has a large impact on how we are going to approach things. And I don't one of the exercises that we did at community level was to have communities help us define what they see child protection priorities as. And they don't necessarily always match because you have gotten funding for a gender-based violence program, or you have gotten funding for a psychosocial support program. Those things may be universally applicable and needed, but they may not correspond to what communities themselves have defined. So I think coming up with quick, reliable ways of consulting communities on child protection, I do think the participatory ranking method is one, but I think we need more, and we need to expand that suite of tools. That would be helpful. We have a comment from Arpana Rongong. World Vision has done great work in CPIE programming for recovering phase after your earthquake, I believe is EQ, so focusing on system strengthening and DRR. So Arpana would love to share the reports, and we'd love to see them. We're over an hour by 10 minutes now. Yes, go right ahead, Pia. And then I think if we don't have more questions, we'll wrap up with Pia's last comments here.
Just one point that I wanted to talk about with regards to the donors. I think it's kind of like a double-edged sword as well, because I was talking to a donor quite recently, and she said to me, she said, look, at the end of the day, all the proposals that we're getting are the same. And so, you know, and she said, we're actually quite open to thinking about things in quite a different way. But it seems like it's the agencies who keep thinking along the same lines all the time. So I do wonder sometimes as well if we don't also put too much on the kind of donor unwillingness. And I'd also like to just say, and I think that's a nice way to wrap up, is like, let's get the learning out there. The more we are open about the learning and we discuss what we're learning, the more likely we are actually going to be able to influence that type of change.
Amen and hallelujah. So thank you so much, Pia. It was really a stimulating presentation. And every time I think about this, I think we do need the structured next step. So if people have thoughts about how we take what I think the research and considerations document as, you know, I think they point us to a place of a need for reform and a pretty dramatic reform of the way that we operate. How are we going to get there? And I think each of us is going to have an important role to play. Thanks to Pia, thanks to all of you who gave us an hour and 10 minutes of your time today. The recording will be available, and we'll also send the document around with the follow-up email that you'll get. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and please be in touch with us. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Pia.
Thank you.